What does it mean to be British? Is it our love of tea? Our royal family? Maybe it's baked beans. Maybe it's our love of Doctor Who despite it being the worst show on television. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something a little more abstract than that. I decided to ask my friends what they thought it meant to be British. I told them not to look it up or consult with anybody else because I wanted their honest, unfiltered gut reaction to my question. My first friend told me that it's not really something he puts any stock into. He'll get equally annoyed at overly patriotic people as he will with those who oppose them. He said it's little more than a novelty to him that occasionally crosses his mind. My second friend had something different to say. He said that Britain to him means opportunity. Excellence, independence, and creativity were not only never punished, but encouraged. He said it's a place where you can stick out from a crowd and feel normal, and that it's a place where many cultures could come together, but not anymore. My third friend had a lot to say about the way Britain is designed to help its people. Our NHS, public transport, and risk-free student loans were all ways in which Britain could increase its people's quality of life. He also had a lot to say about the attitude of the British people. Our demeanour being cool, calm, and collected allows us to be a very self-assured people, for better or worse. In the same way that this assuredness can lead us to do a great many things and help many people, it can also be used selfishly, paving the way for figureheads like Carl Benjamin, Nigel Farage, and Katie Hopkins to use this confidence to mislead people. To this friend of mine, what it means to be British depends on what you use it for. And that last sentiment is reflected by the last friend of mine that I asked. To him, Britishness as a concept is something of a paradox. He rightfully pointed out that Britain as a nation has done a great many things, not least of which is our history of inventors and great leaders. He points to Winston Churchill, who's every British person's number one go-to when it comes to great British historical figures, and it's not really hard to see why with him being Britain's greatest wartime leader possibly ever. However, remember that this friend of mine described Britain as a paradox. In the same way that we have to acknowledge Churchill's great accomplishments, we also need to take into account the darker sides of his past. While it's true that Churchill led us through a time of great peril, it's also true that he caused the Indian Famine, which killed millions of people. These are two sides of the same man that cannot be separated. My friend describes this aspect of Britain as something of a tipping scale. You have to be able to find balance between admiring the good and being accountable for the bad. And as time goes on, he thinks the scales are tipping unevenly, making us blind to the realities of our own history. And that last part is something I really want to get into today. I'm inclined to agree with all of these perspectives, to be honest. Britishness is a concept that seems to always be in flux, where we constantly refer to our past and subsequent contrast from it rather than our future and how we can shape it. And while I do think that consulting the past is important in creating a national identity, I also disagree with the purposes it's being used for in today's examples. More and more, I'm afraid that British culture as a concept is used not as something to unify us and have in common, but as a wedge between certain groups to keep them divided. But that still doesn't answer my question really, does it? I've explained the effects of British culture on its people and maybe hinted towards some ideas or concepts as to what British culture could be, but I haven't been able to give a clear answer so far. Of course, what do I know about being British? I'm just some lefty cuck who's out to destroy Britain. If you want to discover British culture, true British culture, we need to consult true British patriots. Sure, me and Paul Golding have had some differences in the past, but let's put that aside for a moment and examine what he has to say about what it means to be British, so that we can learn from the people who do it better than anyone else. So for people that always want to put it first, what do they think Britishness is? Well, when you take a look at their website, you might be surprised to discover that Britain First generally avoids making any concrete claims as to what British culture actually is. Sure, they have a lot of news articles talking about how British culture is under threat, but what exactly is it that's under threat? I ended up digging a little bit deeper in order to try and find any concrete examples. Besides the occasional claim that Britain and its values are under attack from wokeness, there isn't really anything that could help me get a clearer picture of what Britishness actually is. I stumbled across this section labelled Culture and History and got quite excited for a second, hoping that I'd uncover some actual claims from Mr. Golding rather than just some vague gesturing at our country. This section basically breaks down key elements in the history of Britain's formation as a nation, beginning at the Stone Age, taking us through the occupation of the Romans and the Norman invasion, before finally ending with a string of royalty. This entire section is quite interesting because rather than extrapolate anything from these events, Britain First instead opts to report them very matter-of-factly. This happened, and then this happened, this led to this, and so on. There's no actual link between the formation of Britain and the ties of those events to Britain's people. It's quite transparent to me that whoever put this list together didn't want to have to make any bold claims about what British culture actually is, because then they would have to explain what Britishness is and risk applying these qualities to a wider range of people than they would prefer, and so instead resort to metaphor. Look at all these battles we've won, look at all of these amazing inventors we have, look, we still have our royalty. And then whoever reads this article just extrapolates whatever it means to be British from that. Yeah, we win so many wars, yeah, we love being told what to do by a royal family. I know they're just trying to appeal to the sense of British superiority that they and their supporters have, but it honestly seems like all there is in our foundation, our history and ties back to our roots is warmongering. And that's a very bleak thought. Is our capacity to fight really the only thing that defines us in Britain First's eyes? Remember what I said about Britain First being very careful to only define Britishness through implication whilst also trying to reserve Britishness to specific types of people? For some reason, this entire segment is very concerned with the genetics of the British people, not so much their culture or practices that tie them together. There's several points in their retelling of British history that they take great pains to point out that the British genetic diversity was not largely impacted by hundreds of years of occupation and invasion from various sources. And while that's true in isolated cases, Britain isn't exactly made up of isolated cases. The Roman occupation alone is speculated to have impacted the genes of at least 1 million Brits, with evidence that this impact is present in up to 4 million, which isn't exactly nothing. 6% of people in the UK have been discovered to have Viking DNA, which is over half of what Sweden has at 10%. There were a lot of genetic differences in Vikings themselves too, with studies discovering that they weren't all ethnically homogenous as we would have thought. Of course, this doesn't even matter because, as it turns out, not even British people are as British as each other, at least to the same degree. Depending on which region you go to, you'll find massive variation in ethnicities and genetics within the native population. So where's the cutoff point? Come to think of it, why is there a cutoff point in the first place? Why is Britain First so concerned with the genetic lineage of British people? Well, I would argue that it's important for them to have some sort of cut-off point to qualify as what they describe as the indigenous British population, as opposed to all of those dirty foreigners from elsewhere. If you don't have that, then you open British culture to not being purely genetic, but adoptable by anyone who observes the same traditions as you. And if you point out that anybody can become British given enough time and integration, you've pretty much admitted that Britain First are wrong about immigration eventually destroying our country. God forbid. This is why the rhetoric of these articles bothers me so much. It essentializes Britishness to those who are and those who aren't, and the only time you ever hear people talking like this is when they have a vested interest in keeping people divided. I don't think that culture is determined by some genetic link to the island you were born on, let alone that this means we have anything in common with each other if we do share genetics. There's a phrase that you may have heard if you've ever engaged with people who feel this way, and I wanted to mention it because it so accurately sums up the, for lack of a better term, black and white way these nationalists see things like culture. If a dog is born in a stable, it doesn't suddenly become a horse. Now, this argument has never sat right with me because at best it's just not accurate, and at worst it's a malignant exclusionary phrase that only serves as shorthand for no matter how hard you try and no matter what you do, you'll never be British and you'll never belong. And I mean, I reject this idea entirely because it's predicated on the grounds that there's some gene that makes you belong more to one place than another. Never mind the fact that even people born in the same location have different genes, or the fact that people with similar genes can have very little in common. I'm sure that me and Mr. Golding, as much as I hate to admit any similarity with him, probably share quite a few genetic traits. It doesn't change the fact that I loathe him entirely. If anything, I'm even more embarrassed to share an island with him because of the fact that he so desperately wants to tie us closer together for such a superficial reason. When we talk about culture, we don't exactly mean that Britain is a petri dish with the same bacteria just genetically duplicating itself. I'm sure his argument would have much more weight if Britain was some country full of inbreeding, which, I mean, speak for yourself, Mr. Golding, but I actually welcome diversity in that regard. Speaking of diversity, and I know nothing good can come from a segue like that in a video about a topic like this, remember what I said earlier about Britain First defining their culture as being anything opposed to wokeness? I found several articles from them discussing how the woke mob is threatening British values. Don't get me wrong, they don't say what those values actually are, but it's nice that we have something we know is attacking them. All we have to do now is just work our way backwards and figure out what it is that progressivism is attacking, and there you have it, we'll finally know what British culture actually is. So what great values are under attack according to Mr. Golding? There were three main articles that I looked into during my research. The first, titled "Britain is Degenerating into a Woke Lunatic Asylum," is little more than a laundry list of complaints about wokery ruining our country. Besides one or two claims, there really isn't that much in the way of specifics, and While I'm sure that some of it is due to incompetence, I know for a fact that there's another reason too. Looking at this article, members of my audience from across the pond might be interested to see this picture used as evidence that the woke LGBT/transgender, mate, what do you think the T stands for, is engaging in political pedophilia to indoctrinate and pervert the next generation of children in the UK. Well, there's no evidence to back this up, by the way, just a picture of someone who's wearing admittedly obnoxious makeup, committing the awful crime of reading to a child. Except, you know, how Britain First describes this event isn't what's happening at all. This photo was taken from an event where drag queens, aka performers who don't necessarily identify as women, dress up in an act of theatre and act stereotypically feminine. This isn't the case of some degenerate lunacy or whatever you want to call it, it's just theatre. Let me remind you that this is coming from Britain First, who in their article about famous British pioneers cited William Shakespeare as the world's greatest playwright and literary giant. This is how female characters used to be played in Shakespearean times. If anything, I applaud this performer for abiding by the old methods of dressing up as a woman to such an extreme degree that it ends up being comical. Isn't that the point of drag queens? I mean, it isn't really like any of this matters in the first place. This performer's American and this photo was taken in the Brooklyn Library in New York. So what Britain First has done here, just to clarify, is make a bunch of angry, vile, and outraged claims, and instead of citing actual examples or evidence, found a random photo of someone who isn't even British nor has any ties to British culture, and thrown it in there in the hopes that this out of context picture will appeal to your disgust towards trans people and make this article seem credible. This has said nothing about British culture or how it's under threat, it just vaguely applies to the conservatism Mr. Golding always peddles to his followers under the guise of Britishness. But hey, I'm sure it's a one-off, right? Honestly, if nothing else, it does reek of laziness on the part of Britain First. If they can't even source a photograph correctly, why should we ever take their claims at face value? It's so cynical. They want nothing more than visual material that reinforces their claims and vaguely supports the text you're reading, regardless of where it actually came from. I'm pretty sure whoever wrote this article literally said, it's time for me to find a picture that supports my arguments against the wokes. And that's as far as their thinking goes, without any regard to how relevant it is to the point they want to make. I know this because of the next article titled "The Woke Assault on Our Way of Life." Notice this image taken from an International Women's Day march in Sydney, Australia. You have to wonder how they stumbled across this image in the first place, right? Well, when I first reverse image searched this picture to find out where it actually took place, something interesting came up. A little note on the side told me that this image shows up when you Google search extreme feminist. I don't have a picture of the notification, but I wanted to check for myself to see if this was true. So I searched for extreme feminist, and in the related pictures around the first result, there it was. You can practically hear the thought process of whoever found this image, going for the first result you find and then looking for something a little more inflammatory to piss off your audience of gammons who don't know any better than what you lied to them about. This article loves discussing the British Christian foundation of our way of life, which is a very wordy way of not saying anything about what that foundation actually is besides being religious, and attempts to cite examples of things that are once again under threat from wokeness. They say, ironically, that Britishness as a concept is under threat from woke academics who feel that it creates a false sense of unity. Considering how Britain First themselves uses Britishness as a phrase to create false divisions, I find this to be something of a non-issue. Notice again that Britain First still won't say what Britishness actually is, and I'm beginning to get a little frustrated. Yeah, they mention Christianity, but that only accounts for the last couple thousand years, which, relative to Britain's history, which they cite as existing since the dawn of time,
an unparalleled history that stretches back to the dawn of time,
really doesn't mean that much. Your religion is irrelevant to Britain. Sorry, mate. Christianity as a religion has as much relevance to our country as the one that stemmed from Henry VIII's messy divorce, which, I mean, when you look at how Mr. Golding has treated his exes in the past, gets surprisingly little recognition in comparison. It makes you wonder why Mr. Golding refuses to look at a greedy, wife-abusing failure of a leader with the same amount of identification as something he can mystify as much as the ancient Brits. Makes you think. Well, that's all there is for this article, and yet we're still no closer to uncovering what British culture actually is according to these guys, rather frustratingly. At least we understand a little more about why Mr. Golding chooses to enforce the elements of British culture that he does. So let's see the logical extension of these selective enforcements in the last article for today. We are living in a sick and degenerate society. It's the same story here as in the other articles, with Mr. Golding rattling off a bunch of elements of British culture and heritage that he feels are under threat from treason, decay, immortality, and filth. I think you misspelled a word there, Mr. Golding. You probably meant to say immorality. Not only is this a pretty poor indicator of Britain First quality control, missing a blatant error in the second line of an already short article, but it also completely undermines the point of the article. How are you going to complain about British culture being undermined if you can't even use its language properly? The main gist of this article is that British culture is being erased, with more and more of our heritage and traditions being cancelled, destroyed, and censored by the woke mob. So what exactly is there that's being cancelled? Now, Mr. Golding seems to hold a grudge against the Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to whom he lost a democratic election, for his promise to diversify British street signs. Mr. Golding misrepresents this as the desire to remove any and all signs of Britishness in London by funding anti-British groups to create more diversity, which they cheekily refer to instead as non-British. This is a really strange dichotomy that they're presenting us with, because it implies that Britain fundamentally is incapable of being diverse. This is what I mean when I say that rather than concretely sticking up for British values, Mr. Golding has instead opted to oppose himself to anything woke and just say that that's what Britishness is. He completely ignores the fact that culture isn't dependent on genes, and there are, in fact, to put it lightly, several non-white British people living in Britain. They're born here, they're raised here, and they grow up alongside people from all different backgrounds in the same culture, sharing the same attitudes. Once again, you have Mr. Golding essentializing Britishness in contrast to diversity. I wonder what diversity means in this context. Oh, and there's also the fact that this is a complete non-issue that Mr. Golding is blowing way out of proportion. The only example of a statue being destroyed I could find was that of Edward Colston in Bristol, who was a slave trader. Is this the British culture that Mr. Golding insists is being erased and needs to be preserved no matter what? It's so funny to me that for someone who loves to throw around terms like snowflake, delicate little kittens, and woke babies, he throws such an enormous temper tantrum at the slightest risk of being reminded that black people exist. It's beginning to feel like even Britain First don't really know what British culture is. And I can prove it. Later on in this article's whining, 2 books are described as being banned by the wokes in an effort to destroy what Mr. Golding refers to as our history, culture, and traditions. What books would those be, you ask? Now, the first is Little House on the Prairie. I did a double take when I first read this example because, according to my admittedly limited knowledge of this book, it's set in the frontier of America, written from the perspective of a white settler family. Just out of curiosity, I decided to look into who in Britain was actually trying to have these books banned, and surprise surprise, found absolutely nothing. In fact, even the people who did take issue with the contents of this book were split on what to actually do about it. On the one hand, you had people wanting to revise the book's harmful depiction of Native Americans, because we have so many of those running around in Britain. And on the other hand, you have the people who take issue with it but want it to stay so that we can learn from past attitudes and not repeat them in the future. So, I guess you could say that they're erasing our culture. If by our culture you mean some outdated autobiography of a colonial American, and by erasing you mean not doing that. But maybe we'll have more luck in the second example. The Wizard of Oz. Oh, come on! The Wizard of Oz, for those of you who are unaware, Mr. Golding, is a book set in Kansas, America, written by American author L. Frank Baum. How incredibly British. In fact, it's so British that it's frequently been interpreted as a parable to 19th century American populism, as well as American capitalism, with the titular Wizard of Oz famously mirroring American capitalist John D. Rockefeller. Of course, those are just dumb, artsy interpretations, right? Don't let the fact that this book has been described as America's greatest and best loved homegrown fairy tale distract you from just how incredibly British this book is. I'd love to hear how they explain this one. Hi, I'm Paul Golding, here to tell you why The Wizard of Oz is actually a very British novel. Consider the fact that Dorothy is a foreigner, born in a faraway land with a desert climate. Dorothy makes her way to the prosperous land of Oz without going through passport control, entering the country illegally. Immediately upon arriving in the country, she kills a native citizen and is hailed by the woke traitors who greet her with open arms. She then hears of the leader of this land who can give her anything she wants, which is no doubt a metaphor for the benefits illegal immigrants receive from the British government. On her way to the capital to demand benefits, Dorothy meets 3 unemployed scroungers, lacking brains, heart and courage, no doubt a metaphor for the woke left-wingers who want to destroy this country. Together, the Scroungers make their way to the capital and demand that they have their every wish granted. The heroic wizard instead deports Dorothy, making him the true hero of the story. Why are they even trying to ban such a foundational text of our culture? Anyway, well, when I looked into why The Wizard of Oz was being banned, I came across something unexpected. It turns out that the book has actually been banned several times. The first was all the way back in 1928. The reason? They didn't like depictions of women in strong leadership roles. Now, this is around the same time that women in the UK were marching for equal voting rights, aka more representation and power. If Britain First had been around way back in the 1920s, this is the exact type of wokery that they would have been writing whiny articles complaining about. It's the same for when the book was banned again in 1986, when American Christians protested the book for its apparently anti-Christian messages. Again, this is exactly the type of thing Paul Golding would have been whining about if given the chance. So it's interesting to see him take a firm stance against religious fundamentalism, when that's what he claims British culture is? Right, so I think it's pretty obvious what's actually going on here. Paul Golding, and by extension Britain First, don't actually care about British culture or what it entails for that matter. In fact, I would go so far as to say that they don't know what British culture is, as though them lifting several elements of American pop culture to then trace over British issues wasn't a clear enough indication. So why is this the case? What does Britain First have to gain by misrepresenting, misunderstanding, and misconstruing British culture to such an extreme degree? I'll give you a hint. It's only a skin-deep understanding. Yes, we've come to the point of the video where I make it all about race. Are you ready? It's all about race. And before you jump down my throat for being the real racist, or whatever the hell glib nothing you have to say, I just ask that you hear me out for a second. Mr. Golding has indicated several times that diversity is the polar opposite to Britishness, that the native and indigenous population are one and the same despite this not actually being the case. He has described diversity, by which he means black British people, as being definitively non-British, despite the fact that we did kind of force them to grow up in our culture and integrate in the process of doing so. Of course, I've already covered the fact that Mr. Golding can't admit that culture is more than genetic, because then his entire argument, purpose, and worldview falls apart quicker than shortbread. Well, there's something British for you. Our crusty ass biscuits, you're welcome world. You can see this attitude that Britishness and whiteness are one and the same in the description of this video titled, "It is white people that are oppressed." Britain First leader Paul Golding outlines in this hard-hitting video that contrary to the media's relentless propaganda, it is actually white people that are facing oppression in their own country. White people in their own country. This is what I mean when I say that Mr. Golding's understanding of the British is just code for white people. Of course, he can't say that because then he risks admitting his racism, and if he does that, then he's just wasted a bunch of money remastering that video I already responded to where he admits that there are white and African countries.
We are just as opposed to mass immigration from white nations in Europe as we are from African nations.
We are just as opposed to mass immigration from white nations in Europe as we are from African nations.
I don't know how much more obvious he can make it. And I know that whiteness takes priority for these guys because of this comment under the degeneracy article. Let's go Brandon, fuck Joe Biden. This is a comment heavily reliant on knowledge of American hegemony in politics, something you'll see is quite prevalent in Britain First content spread throughout their website. Also frequent is their display of support for Donald Trump, which I mentioned in my second video ever. This is another image that made me laugh when I saw it because, well, what relevance does Donald Trump have to British culture? This is something that I've noticed since the beginning of my channel, and I'm glad to be delving into it in more detail because it really does reveal how superficial Britain First are and how they determine what they stand for. Our politics and America's are as separate as they are the same. I can't concretely define what Britishness is, but I know what it isn't, and that's American culture. So why does Britain First have a Confederate flag in their purely British training centre? What is that all about? Thus we come to the boiled meat and potatoes of the issue, that Britain First is more concerned with upholding white conservatism than they are British values. They will lift elements of American popular discourse and dress it up as a British issue like a bulldog that's hungry for scraps, because America was founded on values of white supremacy, and it's easier for Britain First to parrot these same ideals than actually look out for the British people. There's also the fact that most of their Facebook followers before they got banned were from America, which is probably why they still have to play this weird game of appeasement to them. You can see this in their policy that elects to ban critical race theory from being taught in schools, voted in on the 26th of March. What's funny about this is that it was voted in an entire 2 days after critical race theory first became a hot button issue in America. You can clearly visualize Mr. Golding's panic as he learned about critical race theory and then scrambled to have it banned in the UK as quickly as possible without further consideration. Mr. Golding has to try and ban learning about racism in a country that gained its legacy of tea drinking from slavery and colonialism for fear of those tools we use to learn about and analyze history being used to erase our country's history. So yeah, Britain First doesn't understand what British culture is, or they do know but choose to ignore and erase the truth of the matter because it's easier to mix and mash various elements of white cultures together to fit your anti-immigration, white nationalist rhetoric. So what does it mean to be British? Simultaneously everything and nothing. Mr. Golding is obviously using Britishness as a euphemism for whiteness, as though that doesn't minimize the sum of what it means to be British to something passive rather than something that we engage in. It seems like Britishness is something that just happens to you rather than a cultural thing that we can adopt. You can see this in Mr. Golding's own words, where he explicitly states that you are not just your race, but also your racial background.
Because of their racial background.
And all this does is alienate multiple generations of not only foreign-born citizens, but their children who were born in our country from being recognised as British, no matter how hard they try. And you might consider this a foolproof argument, these guys aren't British because they weren't born here, and if they were, then they haven't descended from enough British stock. And I've already delved into the potential issues with tying nationality to genetics, not least of which that this is an argument for ethno-states, which, I know that's what Britain First wants because I've argued against it in the past, but that doesn't validate their arguments, sorry. My main issue with this pure genetic Brits thing is that there's no line we can draw that doesn't alienate generations of Brits from the place they call home. Just think about it for a second, Paul. Neither of us have pure genes because there is no such thing as British genetic purity. Just hear it from your own supporters' words. This guy here was born in England, but descended from Scottish and Irish ancestors. Paul Golding has already revealed that he considers England a white country, and I'm saying England and not Britain because for a very long time the Irish were considered beneath the native population of England, particularly during the Irish refugee crisis caused by the potato famine of 1845. Yeah, turns out that our current refugee crisis isn't the first we've experienced, nor will it be the last. This commenter right here is only safe by circumstance, not because of any qualities that make him special. If Britain First was around 150 years ago, this person who now supports insularity in Britain would have been on the opposite side of the wall. This is why Britain First rhetoric angers me so much, because history has proven time and time again that there is always a scapegoat to try and expel or blame your country's problems on. It was the Irish in the past, it's the Syrian refugees right now, and it's going to be some other disenfranchised minority again in the future if nothing changes. If you are a white Britain First supporter, I want you to just sit back and think about how lucky you are that there's another visually obvious scapegoat to blame all of your issues on to divert attention away from yourselves. Because I promise you this, if you, by some miracle, gave Paul Golding everything he wanted and created an ethno-state, you would be next. Your Britishness or that of your ancestors has likely come under scrutiny in the past, and just to remind you, human rights are not linear. They can be lost and they can be forfeit if you give those that wish to take them away from you the chance to do so. So just think about what you're supporting before you give Mr. Golding a rope to hang you with. But let's say that Mr. Golding got what he wanted, and we kicked all foreign-born and not completely genetically British people off of our island and kept to ourselves. That would not mean that the remaining people are the same. Need I remind you that for hundreds of years, the people living on the British Isles waged war, killed and conquered each other and developed their own practices, religions, mythologies and cultures, each distinct and unique from one another. The boundaries are incredibly arbitrary, and Britain First only wants to enforce them because then they get the ethno-state they want. Never mind the fact that Britishness changes depending on where you go in Britain. If you drive 20 minutes down the road, you'll find someone with a different accent who a few hundred years ago would have been at war with you and yours in the service of some lord somewhere. They come here, they don't speak our language, they kill our people in the service of their Arabic god and their king from another country and expect us to just accept them into our land. These Brits are going too far and someone has to stop them. So what does it mean to be British? Well, Britain First would have you believe that the extent of Britain's diversity lays in the various targets of their invasion and colonization, when they aren't too busy denying that those undeniable aspects of our history exist. I say bollocks to that. You can't arbitrarily cut off foreign cultures that you don't like, because then you open up the floodgates for the foundations of the things you do like to come into scrutiny. You'll never hear Mr. Golding talk about the fact that our language is just a buffet of various other languages we've adopted, or that our royal family they worship so much is descended from Germans, or even that their Christian god is very much rooted in Middle Eastern religion. All of these elements that Mr. Golding himself insists are fundamentally British are also fundamentally not. I can't give an answer as to what it means to be British, but I can definitively tell you that exclusion, isolation, and insularity are not British values. If they were, we wouldn't have had all those foreigners fight on our behalf in the Battle of Britain, we wouldn't have had half of the traditions we do now, and we wouldn't have a Britain as we know it today. And there's one more thing I want to mention before I finish. Those of you with a keen eye might have noticed the background I'm using for this video and wondered why I decided to use it above some nice countryside or something. Well, for those of you who are unaware, this is the Abbey Road crossing, famous for its usage in the cover of the Beatles album of the same name. This crossing is famous not only for the album cover, but also for how many people almost get run over trying to recreate the album cover every day. You've probably seen some of them trying to do it over the course of this very video. And I wanted to bring this up because I think it perfectly sums up my feelings towards Britain first and how they try and force this narrative of what Britishness is. Yeah, what they're looking at is part of the picture, but only a part of it. If you take a look at it from another angle, it almost becomes unrecognisable. That doesn't mean that this new perspective is invalid. If anything, it's important. It's important to look at things from a new angle and not get caught up trying to force an old perspective of things. If you do that, you won't see the things you need to see before it's too late. And trying to force one narrow viewpoint makes you look ridiculous to everyone who can see the bigger picture. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. So the next time you try and take a look at such a broad picture through such a narrow lens, just remember, whether it's Britain's history of slavery and its continuing legacy, the fact that Britain's foundation is in diversity when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, you can't ignore the bigger picture forever. And the longer you keep trying to capture that album cover or snapshot of Britain's past that you want to endure to this very day, the more devastating it will be for you when societal change suddenly hits you, just like that double-decker bus you were ignoring when trying to recreate the past that doesn't exist anymore. Thanks for watching, everyone. This video was a little less research-oriented than usual, but I thought it was important to acknowledge these divisions that are being forced on us and why they're happening. If you enjoyed what I had to say, make sure to subscribe to my channel, leave a comment about what you think it means to be British, and make sure to stay tuned for the next video. In the meantime, you can find me on Patreon, where I'll be uploading a couple bonuses that got cut out of this video for time's sake, but if you feel like throwing a few quid my way for some bonuses, then follow the link to the description. You'll also get the ability to vote which video topics you want to see next, as well as see ahead of time what the video will be about, as well as the live Q&A when the video does get published. In the meantime, if you're craving something a little more abstract and philosophical, I highly recommend you check out Satanic Panic. They're working on a series called Why Veganism at the moment, where they attempt to build from the ground up a philosophy that combats every way in which we commodify and exploit animals. I'm lucky enough to have never seriously studied philosophy in my life, but that also means that I'm sometimes left in the dust when it comes to understanding what the hell people are on about. Luckily, these guys are able to explain pretty complicated philosophical concepts in a way that makes it easier to grasp. There's also the fact that these videos are beautifully shot and incredibly well produced, with my favourite style of dry humour thrown in for some good measure, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with next. So yeah, go check them out, send them some love for all the effort they put into their content, and I'll see you next time. Bye.